All right, so we're getting to one of the more enjoyable parts of the workflow, and that is texture baking. So we're going to take our high poly and start to extract some details so we can display it on our low poly here. Now to do that in Substance Painter, I want to come over to the little header that says Texture Set Settings. Now, if you can't find this, somewhere in your Substance Painter UI, yours is maybe a little bit different than my version. You'll want to come over to Window and then go to Views. And down at the bottom there, you'll have this Texture Set Settings. So just make sure that is a little check mark beside it, and then it'll pop up somewhere in your UI, generally around where your layers are. So if this is your first time in Substance Painter, it's going to be a little bit confusing. There's definitely a lot of information coming at you, but the areas that we really need to worry about are these channels and the mesh maps. So just taking a look here at mine, because we selected that PBR metallic roughness template in the last lesson, it's going to set us up with these texture channels, and these are what we're going to want to work with here. So if you have something that's a little bit different and you want to follow along to what we're doing in the course, I'd recommend maybe just creating a new project and enabling that PBR metallic template so that you're going to have the exact same channels as I do. And finally, to bake out our textures from our high poly, we're going to go down to the mesh maps section and we're going to click Bake Mesh Maps. So this is going to bring up a little file dialog. And again, in classic Painter fashion, it's going to give you quite a bit of information. Quite honestly, it is information overload, but we'll take it one step at a time. I want to first draw your attention to the left-hand side here where we have the different types of mesh maps that we can bake out. And I'm just going to uncheck thickness and ID. We are not going to need to bake those textures out just with this particular asset. So I'm just going to remove them from the baking process entirely. Now in our core panel here, I'd like to change the output size to 4K so that we're going to have some really high quality bakes. Now at the end of the day, it's going to be baked down to a 2K texture because I set the project to be a 2K resolution. But generally, it's a good idea to bake out your details in a little bit higher format so that when we bake it all down, it has a little bit more resolution to work with when we're actually working on the asset. The next area I want to go to is down here to our high definition meshes. So this is going to be our high poly here. And I'm going to click on this little folder button. And then this is where I'm going to select that tire_high mesh. So we can open that up. And then I'm going to continue to scroll down until I find anti-aliasing. So I want to select, instead of none, give this a sampling of like 2x2, 4x4, or even 8x8 if you really want to get, the highest quality subsampling. But I'm just going to stick with 4x4. And now the most important section, I think, of the baking process is down here under match. So this is what's going to enable us to bake much cleaner bakes without having to explode our mesh. So what I mean by exploding our mesh is when we do a texture bake, what generally happens is it casts rays out from our low poly version to land on the faces of the high poly version and extract the detail from that high poly version. Now you're going to run into an issue with that if you have an object like this, where we have 3 different objects that are all kind of intersecting with one another. So you're going to get a lot of issues around the faces and the parts that intersect with one another when we're baking, because there's going to be a collision of these rays casting out and hitting surfaces that don't actually belong to the high poly version of the asset we're trying to bake. So traditionally, what we would have to do is take our asset and actually explode out the pieces, moving them away from each other so that when we bake it, they're not going to be intersecting and they're going to be far enough away that each piece is baking with the correct high poly version, and it's not going to have any collisions of those rays casting out. But because we've gone ahead and named our pieces appropriately, we're going to be able to mitigate all of that inconvenience, and we can just go and simply select by mesh name, so that this is going to use these naming conventions to tell Substance Painter which models belong together and to not bake any intersecting rays from any of the other objects. So once we've done that, I think we're going to be able to go ahead and hit Bake Selected Textures. And this is going to run through just a very quick baking process of extracting all the details. And so let's take a look and see what that looks like. All right, so it's gone ahead and baked out our mesh maps, and you can see that it's started to populate some of these areas over here. It's also gone ahead and applied this onto our low poly model. And if I just shift and right click to move our light source around, it's looking like we got a pretty clean bake. And again, this is just our low poly version. If I come up over here and scroll all the way down to show our wireframe, we can see that this is indeed just the lower poly version that we had, with all of those higher poly details extracted and baked down into textures. Now we can also go and isolate these specific bakes if we come up into our shading models here, and we can see if we scroll down that we have a mesh maps section. So if I go and select the normal, this is the normal map that it's gone and baked out from our high poly. We can take a look at the world space, ambient occlusion, which is really cool. This is going to be our shadow detail. We've also got some curvature and position, and these are all of the different ones that we've gone and baked out. And so I wanted to take this latter part of the video to quickly cover a little bit of troubleshooting in case we run into issues. The most common issue being these weird looking bake artifacts. And if we take a look, we're getting it kind of correctly in some areas, but some areas look like they're kind of like being chipped away. And it's going to be all across our model here. And some areas are even just going to be cut off entirely. So when you get something that looks kind of like this baking error here, what this is going to generally be a result of is our low poly not quite matching the required profile or silhouette of our high poly. And I know I really harped on that idea in our retopology video, because this is the result you're going to get if you're not matching your low poly as close to your high poly as you can. So let's go back to Blender and take a look at how we can solve this issue. So here in Blender, this is my low poly, and it looks all right, but if I bring up my high poly again, and I go into edit mode, you can see that we're not matching the silhouette as best as we can here. And even if we go into front view here, we can see that we've got a very big discrepancy in the silhouette or the profile. Now, just for demonstrations, I've gone and shrunk this tire down a little bit here on our low poly. So if I just grab these back, we'll see that we're going to want to try and match this like we had initially to better capture that silhouette. And we can almost kind of see the baking errors here. If I go and scale this down, we can see that these faces here are not able to really truthfully capture the detail as we get further away from our low poly mesh. Now in Substance Painter, we do have controls over how far the rays are willing to go when casting out from our low poly mesh. And for something as simple as, this baking error here, that might be able to just help mitigate the issue. But I would strongly recommend, before you start playing around with sliders, coming back into Blender and taking a look at your low poly mesh to make sure that it's adhering to the profile of your high poly as best as it can. Because while the slider is a nice convenient fix, it's not going to be a catch-all solution, and you're just going to sometimes have to come back in and manually fix the profile of your asset to best capture your high poly detail. So now that we know how to fix a very common baking issue within Blender and Substance Painter, Let's take a look at actually starting the texturing process so we can bring some life into this asset in the next lesson.